In the last episode, we looked deeper at the recommendations in the directory, and while we were doing that, we realised that they're written using quite specific language. So we've built a tool that will help guide you through the process of drafting a UPR recommendation to use in stakeholder reports made to the UN. So I'm going to use a hypothetical situation to take you through the recommendation builder today. So we select whether we're concerned about a law, a policy, or a practice, and then the country that we're focusing on, and which rights, one or many, that this particular law violates. Then we're asked if it affects the general population or if it disproportionately affects a specific group of people living in that country. And also then, once we've made that selection, we're asked whether it affects their rights online, offline, or both online and offline. Now you can see on the right-hand side that the recommendation is starting to be created here. We're asked then to continue on to provide detail about that violation. So here I'm just going to use the example in the help text, but if you're aware of a specific law or policy that is being used to violate human rights in a particular country, you would type that in here, and you'd be as specific as possible. So whether that is an article of a particular law or a chapter of that law, you would enter that there and click done. And then there are some options to choose from. So you can choose whether it's good but hasn't been signed into law yet, whether it's good but not consistently applied or enforced, whether it's inadequate and needs to be amended, or whether it simply contains provisions that violate international human rights standards. And then you're asked also whether that specifically discriminates against the persons you had mentioned in the previous screen. So once we've gone through that process, we have a recommendation here that says, for instance, and remember that again, this is a hypothetical example, that Article 399 of the Penal Code should be amended to ensure that LGBTI persons are not excluded from its provisions in order to better protect the freedom of opinion and expression and digital rights of LGBTI persons online and offline. Now, that's just a draft to start from, but it gives a really good structure that you can copy, paste into another document and work on. So it is a bit more detailed when you go through the process to report a practice of human rights violations, and I'll take you through that now, but again, using a hypothetical example. So I'm concerned about a practice in Andorra that violates digital rights. And I'm going to say this time that it affects the general population. And of course, being digital, it does affect their rights both online and offline. So again, that part of the process was very similar to the law or policy track, but now is where it gets a little bit different. So first I'm asked if there's a pattern of similar violations happening in Andorra that affect the digital rights of the general population online or offline, or if it's about an individual case. Now, if I select that it's about an individual case, I'll be informed that the Universal Periodic Review is not an appropriate space to raise individual cases unless they're illustrative of a broader pattern of human rights violations. So I can then say, well, that's fine, I can report that as a pattern, and I can say here that, for instance, increased surveillance of communications online is what I'm concerned about. Now, if I say here, for instance, that it's non-state actors who are responsible for the increased surveillance of communications online, I'm then asked to name that. Here I'm just going to use the help text so that I can go through, but again, here you would name specifically the group of non-state actors that is responsible for that practice. Now, I'm asked here whether the activities are condoned by the government or not. And depending on what I answer, depends on what questions I get next. So here, if I say that yes, they are condoned and the state is financing that group, my recommendation would be framed as to cease funding that group because of the violation that they're doing. If it's about the fact that they've made official statements encouraging or celebrating the activities, then my structure of my recommendation changes to officially condemn those activities. And if I select that the state controls them, then it says implement effective measures to ensure they cease the practice that they're doing. Now, if those activities are not condoned by Andorra's government and the state is doing something to prevent and punish them, again, I would be informed that the UPR is not an appropriate place to raise this as a recommendation. But if the state is not doing anything to prevent and punish those activities, my recommendation is structured as prevent and punish the activities of that group. Now, if I go back up here, you'll remember that in this instance, I chose non-state actors. I get a different track if I choose the state or state actors. Now here, it would ask me if the violations are part of an official policy or law. If I answer yes, then I'm recommended to report it as a law or policy violation instead. But if I'd rather focus on the practice, I can click through to answer some more questions. So, is this justified by the need to safeguard a legitimate interest? If it is not, then the recommendation starts to take a different shape and saying take measures to ensure there's a legitimate safeguarding interest. And then is what they're doing proportionate to the aim or what they're hoping to achieve? So if it is proportionate, then nothing is added to my recommendation. But if it is not proportionate, then it is added to ensure strict adherence to the principles of legality, necessity, and proportionality. And again, the same when I answer these questions. If there is judicial oversight before the measure is implemented, then the practice would probably not be violating international human rights standards. If it is afterwards, again, the practice itself is probably not violating the human rights standards, but the fact that judicial oversight is only given after a measure has been implemented would be something that you could raise a recommendation about. If there is no judicial oversight, then again, that would be added into the recommendation to take measures to implement effective judicial oversight over that practice. And again, once you've finished structuring the draft of your recommendation, you can then copy it, paste it into a text document and edit it, and click reset to start again. In the next screen capture video, I'm going to take you through the matchmaker tool, because once you have a recommendation that you've drafted or an issue that you're concerned about, you need to be able to identify which countries would be most likely to take your recommendation forward at the Universal Periodic Review.